The Mind Body Life show, hosted by Frederick Entenmann on Global Voice Radio on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern. During his show, Mind Body Life founder and best-selling author Frederick Entenmann investigates the little-known insights and daily methods used to create explosive life transformations and transitions with those that have risen from struggle and ascended to greatness. Here is your Mind Body Life host, Frederick Entenmann.
Welcome to the Mind Body Life show. I am your host, Frederick Entenmann. I am a former professional athlete. I'm a best-selling author of Surviving Sports in the Game of Life. I'm a coach and consultant, and I help athletes win the game of life. This is episode 10, and I am extremely excited. Also extremely passionate for this episode 10. Because the premise is going to be when or how athletes possibly transition back into life after the sports bubble. And the whole reason why I even have this show, the whole reason why I have Mind Body Life, why I founded it, and continue as a pioneer amongst the sports world to help athletes with their mind, body, and life harmony is because of what happened to me in my personal story, which I'm not going to share now, but it's very pronounced for people who know my background. But all I can say is this very topic alone is what drives me in this lifetime. And while I might not provide all the answers just in this one episode, I can say without question, transition planning, if you are an athlete at the highest level and you reach professional, if you know a professional athlete or if you are a professional athlete, spread the word. There's no one else in the world doing what I'm doing because I founded my own philosophy. Having been there, done that. Transition planning or even deconstructing the athletic bubble is really important to look at, especially as retirement draws near. Through a sports person's career, as retirement looms, there's a huge need for not only solid support, but constant education and unending preparation. And that's not even the end. It's during and then even after retirement that many athletes need further support. And prior to this, I was also one of the top elite researchers amongst elite performers, and in particular gifted and talented prodigies and students. In a lot of the research I used to do, it suggests there's important things to consider even before adulthood, because really many high ability let's just say performers or athletes are celebrated through the eyes of the public through something that's expressed physically, but really all of this and everything in life as we know it, it's really contingent upon self-worth. And unfortunately, the raw truth behind athletics, behind the sports world, and the more success that one attains, almost breeds negative outcomes because of what it's become. And I know that's a very bold statement, but I also know many, many, many individuals that would agree. But that's besides the point. I'm not looking for that. It has more or less to do with no outcome, really, because every individual is on their own journey, and that's what I want to stress most. But as a whole, you know, let's let's just look at a basic transitional plan of putting that in place before retirement. Athletes are trained to push through pain. We all in all ignore hardships. We endure sacrifice after sacrifice. It's utterly the price of victory. Everyone's chasing it. Especially if you're somewhat um, driven and especially competitive, and winning is really what gets your juices going. And as an athlete, I was taught it, and as a coach, I kind of initially preached it, but the trade-off is the shared experience with other athletes. It's those teammates or even fellow competitors. It's getting wrapped up in the competition. That's really why I took things to whole other levels. I got wrapped up in the competition. I love to win. Not necessarily, unfortunately, that I had the support of my coaches and especially teammates. That's unfortunately not my story. But I do know a lot of people that are in the other boat where they have the support of their coaches, they have the support of their supporters. But all in all, in the athletic realm, we strive together, and there's a united camaraderie that it all creates. It's almost like the war stories. War is kind of the same environment. People were sacrificing their bodies and psychological minds, but created this. You hear it all the time, a brotherhood or bondhood, and then it's that very intimate bonding that's special. And we're introduced to it slowly through our formative years as well. We learn how to acclimatize to the pressure. Um, and all in all, we're supported by our passion for whatever sport it is, no matter what route you can take. And even these days, I can say this because I support two of my very own children, and there's never been more support ever in the field of sports. All these clubs in the funding and the sponsorships, it's unbelievable. But what happens when those stadium lights are turned on and our careers and the fans, find someone new to cheer for? Does our training help or hinder us in preparation for life after sport? It's a very powerful question to ponder upon. But over, I'd say over the years, just in the process of becoming a best-selling author and kind of owning what I'm doing, I've spoken to dozens of recently retired and retiring athletes, and conducted interviews and written hundreds of blogs as well for companies. But kind of in the comfort of this research, in quiet conversations as well, away from the perceived judgment of the real world, I came up with 5 themes in all transitions that athletes tell me about. They tend not to admit to anyone else. And the number one thing is, folks, it's tough. It's really, really tough. Um, Number two, takes a lot of time. It takes a ton of time. And number three, it's very expensive. Number four, it requires planning and replanning, constant planning. And number five, it's actually made easier by talking about it. That's why not everyone reaches the professional level and makes that 1%. It's so much easier to just talk about it than go through that journey. But for many athletes who've been pretty much the best in their chosen field, it's really hard to admit this to anyone, is it? Because our egos want to protect ourselves from the reality that things have changed. And we have a long way to get back to the top in our new adventures, in getting out of that sports bubble that supported this hierarchy. And once you reach the top, you're thrown out into real life, and it's this whole new game. You know, and I love a quote from actually in Australia, rugby guy, that told me what makes it more difficult is that we don't feel we can talk about our new peers or colleagues because they aren't experiencing it, and they think athletes have lived the blessed life. We can't talk to our friends who are still playing because they're still in the bubble as well. And I love that, because for all athletes, I believe it's not a matter of if, but it's actually when. So if you believe, as we do, that knowledge is kind of the precursor to experience, then through this show, episode 10, now I think I'll kind of help identify what. So maybe even athletes, or if you're a listener, you know, an athlete, you can pass this on to broaden the how. And I want to revisit number one. Like I said, it's really, really tough, especially life after a sport, because a sport essentially defines an individual when you're a professional, and so you think. It's the ultimate disillusionment. And if you think about it, making the top of any sport is really, really tough. But transitioning to a successful life after that sport is even tougher. It's equally tougher, if not more. I would say more, because there's so many variables. There's just not a single skill set you need to master. It just comes at you in every different, unimaginable ways. And for most elite athletes, our passion for a sport and the confidence we gain from our abilities developed naturally. We didn't have to question it. You know, I would just go out and play. It was something I knew I loved. It was my chosen sport, and I had confidence in it, and had built that over many, many years of those small victories, and then the compliments behind the achievement. So unfortunately, life after sport can be quite the opposite. Now, athletes have to consciously question what they're interested in, where their strengths lie, create their own confidence in a very hostile environment where they're often working their way from the bottom up. You know, not everyone's that 1% that's signing for $200 million these days. It's blown out of proportion. The truth is, most elite athletes are actually scavenging and poor. But they have to constantly rebuild or renovate their identity and that self-worth to adapt to those new challenges and environments. It's really, really tough, really tough. And the great news for elite athletes is, you know, we often eat tough for breakfast. And that might sound very egotistical, I know, but the trick is really to realize what's ahead of you, okay? And I'll go back to the Australian rugby player, and actually I was quoting Shane Webcke, one of Australia's most famous rugby league players. And another quote, this guy is great, another quote he has is, if someone had just told me it was going to be really tough for a while, I could have prepared for it. And that's unfortunately true. That's actually why I do what I do, is to help athletes prepare for it. Because I recognize that back when I refer to as my downfall or most difficult times in life, I really looked back and thought, wow, I really could have used someone to help me prepare for this transition. But, number two I have on my list is the transition also takes time. One doesn't suddenly become a professional elite athlete. It takes years and years and years and years, approximately 10 to 12 years of consistent, constant skill work and development actually to become a professional. But the transition takes time. And in my experience, a successful transition actually will take between 2 to 3 years, whereas an unsuccessful one can last a lifetime. And it drives me nuts. I have a ton of compassion when I see or read or hear about an athlete that's signed for over $10 million and suddenly they're broke. And suddenly they have 3 different children with 3 different partners and so on and so forth. Every story seems to be different, but also whenever we hear about an elite athlete, it's usually, unfortunately, not um, shined upon pleasantly, right? We hear about it all the time. But 2 to 3 years, it might sound like a long time, but if you just compare it to the time it takes to transition from a young aspiring athlete to an elite level competitor, that usually takes up to 10 years. 2 to 3 years is very manageable. Okay, the trick is knowing your destination. What sort of life are you aspiring to? It goes back to your purpose. Refer to some of my earlier podcasts. If I recall, podcast number 8 was about purpose. But the reason it takes so long is because you're adapting to massive changes in your life. Massive. Suddenly, you have to think of an actual career, which was formerly your career was your sport, but now you're talking about a legitimate career. Now you're talking about a financial flow. Where's that going to come from? You're talking about relationships, from intimate to family to friends. You're talking about physically. Most athletes I know are pretty shabby in their 40s, and the body starts to go because we sacrifice our bodies for the sport our entire formative years, and that catches up. What's your plan? Mentally, you know, mentally, it's almost like you have to restart. That transition can be brutal psychologically. For most people, look at it this way: a significant change in one of these areas, just one, would take time to adjust to. Okay, and most people I know that want to be better, they seek out so-called life coach to improve in one of these areas, whereas athletes are often facing changes in every area all at once. And I want to say that again because it's so profound but so true, and most don't even consider, we're not even prepared for this. Who can possibly take on, for most people, a significant change in just one of these areas would take a lot of time to adjust to, whereas an athlete are often faced changes in every single area all at once. Pretty, pretty powerful, and it's very overwhelming. So prioritizing which one or two areas that are most important to athletes, typically when I coach or consult, I'll start with one or two areas just to kind of speed up the transition process and help the athlete avoid that overwhelming feeling. And all can be made easier by planning and taking that action during an athlete's sporting career as well. It's not that difficult. It's just prioritizing. Um, Number 3 is the transition is actually really expensive. For some athletes, like I said, who don't earn much from their sport, this might seem absurd. While it's for bigger earners, it should actually be obvious, because the more funds and support and monies and sponsorships that comes at you, actually the higher your skill level needs to be, and the better your emotional quotient needs to be developed. But for all athletes, there are costs involved with stepping away from the sport, which may surprise you actually. And I've come up with about 5 things all in all, in general, which almost certainly number one, I'd say money formerly earned from the sport. This is the obvious one. And number two, paying for your own physical and medical well-being. Number three, clothing, particularly for work situations. I know a lot of former athletes are just suddenly going to business, and you have to buy suits and shoes and all these things to support that lifestyle. Number four are actually costs associated with that general age in life. For example, if you have children, or mortgages, or the sports car payments, whatever that may be. And number five is actually upskilling yourself in other education. Reinvesting in yourself. It's growing. It's developing those real life skills to ensure that transition back in life is just as successful as your sports career. That is why I provide the services I do, to ensure an athlete, when they invest in themselves, I want to help them win the game of life. The cost of lost earnings is obvious, but it can be significant for athletes in popular sports, actually with up to a 75 to 80% reduction in income for most athletes, and it's even higher for the absolute superstars. So you compound this with paying for your own gym memberships or doctors and the physio bills, which actually can be ongoing depending on how your body's held up. And the reality that most of even your meals are no longer covered. I know former professional athletes that are scrapping just to eat. And just suddenly, my point is, this all starts to add up. And even your sport and your sponsors no longer give you clothes and shoes. And in most jobs, you can't just wear the same outfit either to work every day. So you'll need to buy some threads, right? And all in all, I also, through the research, for most athletes, this transition back into real life happens between the ages of 25 and 35. And the time that many people look to even start families or purchase properties and make those serious life decisions, mortgages and the children, they just quickly eat up a large portion of these athletes' budget. And without the proper planning, this can add some serious stress, and it kind of stretches most of those transition experiences. At the same time, as all of this is suddenly happening, many athletes will be required to kind of upskill or retrain themselves to enhance their opportunities in the real world. I cannot stress how important it is to reinvest in yourself if you're an athlete, to work on your real life skills. Generally speaking, I've known athletes that reinvest in themselves, and those costs can be anywhere from $2,000 to, hey, if you want to go back to school, you know what? Certificates will cost up $25,000, and then you go back to university, and a qualification like, let's just say, an MBA, that can cost up to an excess of $150,000. And if you really want to reinvest in yourself, A-list coaches or someone like me is going to cost you in excess of up to $100,000 as well. But Many of these are subsidized for elite athletes during their sporty careers, as well, whether that's either through scholarships or career education programs. But it's the failure to take advantage of these, or even correctly aligning an athlete to do what you want to do. It really means the cost can be deferred to you, or that you take it granted. I just can't stand to see in formative years elite athletes make bad decisions. But this kind of leads up to what's on my list on number 4. It leads to planning. Life after sport takes a lot of planning. And it's, again, I'm going to go back to an Australia rugby player who had great comments, who really communicated that he was a planning freak. And it gave me a lot of great insight, actually, into the level of planning required for a successful transition, because this individual made that successful transitions, probably represents 1% of athletes. Um, but her name is Liz Ellis. She was Australia's famous netball captain. Liz had the knowledge of seeing her husband had ruled out of a rugby career before her retirement, and also a near career-ending injury to scare her into action. So um, the steps she took to research and prepare for the retirement gave her one of the smoothest and most enjoyable transitions of anyone I've ever spoken to. She started her own business alongside her career that actually supported her financially. She took it upon herself to research the physical effects of detraining. And also, by the way, my master's thesis was on the detraining process, so that helped shed a little insight. But the impact that this had, actually, on the hormonal production and how that impacts mood. Um, and she actually created a training plan to manage this all on her own. Really amazing. And then she wrote a list of everywhere she'd ever wanted to holiday, but hadn't because of sport, and booked them throughout the first year of transition. Pretty cool. And the last thing I really liked was she gave herself time to just be herself and switch off after finishing netball. And that is key. One of the things I preach and practice is athletes actually need to practice quietude. You're constantly in fight or flight. You're geared around putting yourself in fight or flight. So you need to practice being quiet. I love that. Um, but anyway, all this planning gave Liz the peace of mind to relax. She's confident in the knowledge that her future was safe. So she had that confidence in knowing, because she was well organized and was able to enjoy life after her achieving elite level and made that smooth transition. She just created it for herself and felt in control rather than in a free fall of that 99% or 95% of athletes feel, of just more or less stepping off a cliff. But I think a lesson to all athletes is that all of this can be prepared whilst you're still competing. Very important point is just please don't wait till it's too late. Prior to starting her own business, Liz actually completed a law degree alongside her netball, and she felt that all of these parallel interests and skills and her strengths not only prepared her for retirement, but it aided her on-field performance rather than detracting from it. But Liz also invested in herself, and she had a coach to bring these realizations and work on herself to make that transition. Sport can be a cruel travel companion at times as well, and that's something I have perspective on. The travel will absolutely beat you up if you're not prepared. And at times it puts a lot of unexpected bumps in professional athletes' road. So that ability to plan your life outside of sport, again, it not only prepares you for the transition, it also puts you in the driver's seat regardless of what life seems to throw at you. And it's partly, again, going back, why I love what I do is to help an athlete be successful and win at the game of life. Because unfortunately, I was not personally prepared, and I like to not only share my own story, but I have a lot of friends that were also not prepared. And watching the choices in making those, unfortunately, having to go through those unfortunate life events that could have otherwise been prevented is quite a shame. This has really been what I feel a very valuable episode. Again, if you're an athlete and this has hit home to you, maybe you're a professional athlete, maybe you know someone that's a professional athlete and continues along a path that need otherwise not be continued, please refer them to this episode. Again, I am Frederick Entenmann. You can find me on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Always feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have a talk with you or consult. It's been a great episode. I hope you tune in the future, and take care.
Thank you for joining us. Listen every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern to Frederick Entenmann's Post Mind, Body, Life. Connect with Frederick at www.globalvoiceradio.com. Tune in next week for another edition of Mind, Body, Life on Global Voice Radio.